Today we're going to look a little bit outside of the realm of a science paper. We're going to look at a individual case study that was published in a journal called Case Reports in Ophthalmological Medicine. And the paper that we're going to be looking at is a case report, as the journal title implies, called Retinal Detachment Due to CrossFit Training Injury. Now, what caught my eye about this was that it was about a CrossFit injury, and as most of you know, I've been investigating and writing about CrossFit for about a decade now. So let's get right into it and look at the first passages that the authors wrote. Specifically, they say that CrossFit is a new strength and conditioning program with short but intense daily workouts. These workouts include strength and resistance training with elastic resistance bands. We wish to report a case of a retinal detachment occurring following elastic band breakage during a CrossFit workout. All right. Well, this particular paper isn't necessarily scientifically unsound, since it's a single case report of an injury. And that's what it does. It reports an injury and the treatment and its outcome. But it is a poorly done case report, as it only reports diagnostics, therapeutics, and outcome with virtually no patient history provided, and there's no description of the circumstances of the injury. So it doesn't provide us anything that can aid trainers in avoiding similar circumstances in the future. Now, let's first things first, make something clear. Elastic bands aren't a primary tool of CrossFit training. Elastic bands, like TheraBands and exercise bands, are predominantly used traditionally in group exercise settings and in clinical rehabilitation settings. Now, let's take a look at some people using traditional elastic bands in a traditional setting. Now, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of papers cataloged in the National Library of Medicine espousing the use of elastic bands in improving fitness across virtually all populations, including the elderly and the young. Now, however, they are creatively used for limited applications in athletic training, strength training, and conditioning, in powerlifting and weightlifting, and in other sports. The NSCA's Essentials of Strength and Conditioning, Strength Training and Conditioning, proposes using elastic bands as part of training for training purposes. Now, their use in CrossFit is as a means to reduce the body weight, reduce resistance in some body weight movements. In order, basically, we're offloading a portion of the trainee's body weight in order to scale the resistance to the trainee's individual ability. Now, this isn't the only place that this is done. We actually described this and detailed this and pictured this in the editions of Starting Strength. So let's get right next to the next bit here and actually look at how the authors described the injury. Essentially, this is what was said. He was engaged in a CrossFit workout doing pull-ups with an elastic band around his waist and secured to the pull-up bar, thus partially supporting his weight. And the elastic band snapped and hit his right eye. That's it. That's the whole description and background of the injury. So he was tied to a piece of equipment with some kind of elastic band during a CrossFit WOD. That's a good question. If you know anything about the structure of CrossFit workouts, this really doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to transition from exercise to exercise or progress through the rounds if you were tied to a piece of equipment. Lashing someone to the pull-up bars just reminds me of somebody hanging there in the middle of a gym in something like a Johnny jump up little baby exerciser. This would actually prevent the individual from doing anything except working with that particular apparatus, doing pull-ups. Now, if being tied to the pull-up bar by something like this apparatus actually occurred, then it's unlikely, very unlikely, that the injury occurred during a actual WOD. It would be more likely that it occurred during some kind of developmental work, working on pull-up ability, and that was probably going to be done outside the context of a workout of the day. So it's probably pretty safe bet, and it's likely that this didn't actually occur during what we would consider a traditional, as written, workout of the day. So it wasn't actually during CrossFit training per se. Now, regardless, it did occur in a CrossFit facility. Well, we can't say that either. That's not in this paper. The paper didn't state whether it was done in an affiliate, didn't state whether it was done at the home, and this isn't a really important distinction to make if you're going to name a commercial trademark system in your headline and criticize it in your paper. Now, what also is missing is a description of the type of elastic band that was actually used. And I would actually think that this would be a really important thing to know, is what type of elastic band did break, causing the injury. Now, I'm pretty sure that the authors had absolutely no clue about the type of resistance band that was being used, simply because if you look up there at this one that's got the brown background, that's the graphic from their paper. It actually has handles. So the author used a picture of handle bands composed of rubber tubing and plastic handles to represent the injurious agent in this particular case. Obviously, this would not be something that you would use to tie and secure someone to a pull-up bar. Even if they did, is it a band that has the 3-pound stretch capacity, resistance capacity? Was it a 30-pound resistance tube, or was some variant in between? Was it a braided rubber cord? I mean, just on this graphic right here, we also see a bunch of other different types that are commercially available. Was it a braided cord? Was it an elastic band cut from one of the flat rolls that we see often used in therapy in the clinics? Was it a super band type, one of those big monster rubber bands that are very common in gyms? And was it the 1/2-inch wide one? Was it the 2.5-inch wide one? How big was it? Knowing this, knowing how much the subject weighed, would have helped us in understanding the facts of the case and would enable us to do an objective analysis and aid us in avoiding future occurrences of this. But the authors did not do this. Unfortunately, the authors didn't investigate any element of the circumstances of the actual accident. They didn't look at supervision. They didn't look at equipment. They didn't look at the WOD that was completed when the injury occurred. They didn't look at the training status and more. We could just keep going on with the limitations and the things that were missed in this paper. But what this does mean is that the authors are quite willing to point a causal relationship between injury and to a name brand fitness organization in the title of the paper, CrossFit, and they're further willing to go into and name another name brand fitness organization in the text, P90X. But they don't even know what type of elastic band was used. They don't know the method it was used in. They don't know the physical characteristics and the training history of the patient, of the trainee. This is basic stuff that should have been attended to in a competent paper. Since it's, this is important since it's not only the injury and its management that is important. Isn't the injury causing item, the one that failed, also an important part of this case? I would say it probably is. Now, it's only through a complete presentation of the circumstances of injury that we can make an objective analysis of the circumstances and make informed decisions and recommendations about how to implement possible risk abatement strategies in the gym. Now, this incomplete understanding of what actually happened in the gym and the circumstances surrounding the injury didn't stop the authors from making a couple safety recommendations, albeit they're the stock recommendations that you would see in any OSHA type health and safety course. What were they actually? They were, all right, precautions include the use of protective eyewear and regular replacement of worn elastic bands. Interestingly, when we're considering injuries from elastic cord sources, there have been more and similar injuries as described here in this paper from the elastic cords on safety goggles. And examining the brands before and after use, looking for nicks, punctures, or tears, and discarding worn bands may prevent these injuries is their follow-up recommendation. There's actually no evidence provided by the authors that this wasn't actually done at the gym or at home, wherever this injury occurred. In fact, as far as can be discerned from what the authors actually write, the band or the bands that were used could have been brand new out of the box. They didn't even deign to consider or identify the injurious circumstances relative to the particular piece of equipment. All right. Now, the authors did do something I didn't really agree with, and I think it was uncalled for, is that they attempted to add a scare figure into the paper to cause alarm. Immediately after stating that a broken elastic band can cause the injury type noted in the paper, they throw out a factoid. The factoid says that dialysis and giant retinal tears are responsible for 69% of traumatic retinal detachments. Well, that sounds really catastrophic. Man, CrossFit and these rubber bands cause up to 69% of traumatic retinal detachments. Well, that's not really what it says, but if you're reading it, it just sort of sinks into your head that way. The 69% figure has nothing to do with injuries from exercise-related elastic band use. In fact, it's been noted previously that only 3.8% of all of such injuries occur from accidents with elastic bands. And it's by far more common to have injuries from bungee cords than it is to have injuries from elastic bands. Now, the closest we can get to associating the 3.8% injuries from bungee cord type things actually to exercises is that those injuries that did occur relative to sport and exercise were from accidents that occurred during the use of bungee cords to secure sports equipment. excuse me, like using bungee cords to mount skis to your car, bikes to your car, like in this image right here. I tried to count how many were actually on this particular, whatever you want to call this, mass of bikes on a bug. And I think there's probably around 20 to 25 that I could actually see. And we're using these for equipment transport, not for training. These are the sources of injury. Now, the injury here. This particular single instance of an exercise band breaking, the only injury of this type known to occur, and this is by the author's own acknowledgement, makes the risk of this particular injury the same in an infinitesimally small risk. It carries the same risk as being hit with a falling meteor. Only one instance of that is in the recorded history as well. So, in the context of their 69% and their alarmism here, alarmism is uncalled for. Vigilance is. Let's take care of our equipment and take care of our trainees. When we consider the bottom line or lines of this particular paper, was there an injury that occurred? Yes, absolutely an injury occurred. Was the diagnosis and treatment exemplary? Yes, absolutely. And there was a great outcome for the individual. Was anything concrete presented about the circumstances of the injury that will help us identify and mediate risks of similar injuries in the future? No. And that's a problem.